Hey, what's up guys? In this video, we'll be talking about waterfall photography and how you can achieve your own waterfall photographs in landscape photography right after this. Hey, what's up guys? Welcome into the video. On this channel, we talk landscape photography, taking you out into the field, showing you how to shoot different scenarios, gear reviews, and also post-processing techniques. So if you're new here, if you've never seen this channel before, consider subscribing below. Now on this video, we're talking waterfall photography. How can you actually go out into the field and successfully capture one of those silky smooth, beautiful waterfall photographs in landscape photography? This is a big challenge for a lot of newbies in landscape photography or people who don't have a lot of experience shooting waterfalls particularly, but it's actually not too difficult to do. You don't want to overcomplicate the process, but there are very specific things you want to think about when you go out in the field and try to successfully capture a waterfall photograph. Number one thing you want to do whenever you go out and you approach a waterfall is understand your composition or what the photograph could actually look like as an end result. Now, there are a lot of different factors that you need to think about when you're deciding on what a composition of a waterfall might actually look like. I highly recommend whenever you get to a waterfall, you think about composition first. Before you set up or think about your camera settings or what gear you're going to put on your camera, which we'll get to in just a little bit, you want to walk around the entire waterfall and really think about and study what your composition could look like. Is this going to be a good horizontal waterfall? Is this going to be a good vertical shot? And you want to decide this by the shape of the waterfall exactly. If the waterfall is one of those really high, like straight up and down falls, it's probably going to be a really good vertical composition that you want to make with your photograph. Or if the waterfall is really long, the river is wide, and the waterfall is kind of like this cascading waterfall over a large amount of space going across, those are going to be your better horizontal composition photographs of waterfalls just due to the shape. You never want to compose a shot that goes against what the shape of the waterfall is actually doing. Also look for different items that you can include in the sides of your frame or at the top and the bottom of your frame. What's it actually going to look like? And when you start studying the waterfall, also look at any deadfall that's occurred within the stream itself. Now, deadfall would be any limbs or tree trunks that have actually fallen into the stream and are blocking any views of the waterfall itself. These are objects that are actually distracting from the overall composition and the overall photograph of what you're trying to achieve with a waterfall. Think about this. You photograph this really nice, pristine waterfall, but in the background, you have a giant dead tree that's just fallen into the stream. That's going to distract from the beautiful waterfall that you're trying to compose and shoot. So always walk around and look for those things. If you think you can photograph the waterfall with deadfall in it, try and find angles that reduce the amount of deadfall within the photograph itself. If it's a limb that's fallen into the main part of the waterfall or is stuck on some rocks, feel free to walk in there at your own discretion and get that limb out. Or if you can't, try to compose it in a way where you can't see the deadfall in the waterfall at all. All right, now lastly on composition, you want to look at different foregrounds that you can include in your composition. Now these can be a variety of different things. You can have foregrounds that are cascading waters over some rocks in the foreground. They can be just rocks, or they can be like frothy streams of water that are coming directly at your lens. Depending on where you set up, how close you set up to the water, or what the waterfall actually looks like, whether that's horizontally or vertically, then you can decide what the foreground is going to be. More of those vertical waterfall shots are really cool when you have some streams of water coming at you in the foreground, or some rocks in the foreground as well. The horizontal shots are really cool when you have like side foregrounds, rocks on the corners or the edges of the waterfall that are really like leading lines, blending you right into the photograph itself that lead the viewer's eye into the rushing water that you're trying to capture, which is your main focus. So when you think about foregrounds in your composition, always remember foregrounds are really cool and really useful for a photograph, but they should never take away from the main subject of the photograph, which is the waterfall itself. This can be really difficult to do because foregrounds can be really special elements to a photograph, but sometimes they overpower the waterfall itself and take away from the subject of the actual waterfall. Alright guys, so let's talk about gear when you're going out and photographing a waterfall. We'll get to camera settings in just a second. I know that's really important with waterfalls, but gear first. You obviously need a camera. That's the most important thing you need. You need a good lens selection. Waterfalls can look good with both wide-angle lenses and 70-200 lenses or telephoto looks to a photograph. These can be shot in multiple different ways. Maybe you have like a waterfall that's far away from you that you can see peeking through the trees or in some gaps of the trees. You use a 70-200 to tighten up the distance between the trees and the waterfall and compress those distances to make the waterfall really stand out in like a forest setting. And this looks really good with a telephoto lens to be able to do that. Or you can shoot it with a wide angle and get those huge foregrounds coming at you and leading the viewer's eye to the subject of the waterfall. It depends on where you set up and how good the waterfall looks at different viewpoints, and that goes back to walking around the entire waterfall multiple times to get a good composition. It's also a good idea to have a cable release, that way you don't get any camera shake, because remember, we're going to be using some longer exposure speeds with waterfall photography to really smooth out the speed of the water and the motion of the water, so it's a really good idea to get a cable release as well. And I'll link a lot of this gear that you need for waterfall photography in the video description below, so feel free to scroll down and take a look at those links as well. But the main piece of gear that you need, and this will also be linked below, is a circular polarizer. Now, circular polarizers are really essential for waterfall photography because as you spin a circular polarizer, it reduces the glare on the surface of the water and also reduces a lot of the glare on the plant life around the waterfall as well. This is really cool when you have some rocks just beneath the surface of the water. If you have some really clear water going through the waterfall, you can actually see below the surface of the water down to the rocks, adding a little bit to your foreground. Or if you have a lot of plant life that's reflecting the sky, you can reduce the amount of light coming off of those. Now, waterfall photography is best in cloudy weather or rainy weather just because you have like a natural diffuser of clouds over the sunlight. But the plant life around waterfalls will still reflect the gray off of their leaves coming from the sky. You never really want to go and photograph waterfalls in like midday because you get a lot of distracting highlights and shadows. There are other things that can be shot at midday, but waterfalls is definitely not one of those. You want to wait till really early in the morning, really late in the day, or if you have a solid sheet of clouds covering the sky, acting as a natural diffuser for your waterfall photographs. When you're buying a circular polarizer, what you want to be sure of is it matches the ring diameter on the end of your lens. And you can find that ring diameter written on the outside of your lens. If you look at it, it might say like 68, 72, and you want a circular polarizer that matches that ring diameter for your lens. If you get one that's too small or too big, it's not going to be able to screw on. They also make square rectangular polarizers that you can spin and attach with a filter holder, but I like the circular ones better because they screw onto the end of the lens and you can actually spin those. As you spin them, it either adds glare to the photograph or reduces the glare. I think waterfalls look much better when you spin the circular polarizer on the end of your lens to reduce the amount of glare. That way there's more detail on the motion of the water, the waterfall itself, and it reduces a lot of that distracting glare that you can have in waterfall photography. Now, you do need to know that a circular polarizer will almost always make the photograph darker, so that needs to be taken into consideration in the next step when you're thinking about your camera settings. Now, speaking of camera settings, let's look at some of those. What do you need to know for your camera settings to photograph a waterfall? Well, let's look at exposure speeds first. This is going to be probably one of your most important settings when you're looking at waterfall photography, because you want to streak that waterfall water coming off and cascading over the rocks, but you don't want to streak it so much that you lose all of the detail in the water. You want that silky water coming over the rocks, but you still want to see the lines and the detail in those. Sometimes if you make your exposure speeds too long, you will completely eliminate any detail in the water and it just won't look exactly right. Next up is aperture. You want to make sure you have your entire frame in focus. I think f/16 is like the go-to aperture when you're photographing waterfalls. It's a really good aperture value to use just because it basically ensures that the entire photograph is going to be in focus if you think about hyperfocal distance and getting everything in focus in a waterfall shot. So basically, if your foreground is about 5 to 6 feet away from you and that's in focus and you're using hyperfocal distance at f/16, everything into infinity is going to be within focus beyond that. Now, f/16 is a really good one to use. You might be tempted to go to f/22. I've noticed on a lot of lenses, when you go up to f/22, sometimes you're losing some detail within the waterfall in the distance or close up. So I like to keep it on f/16 as a really good aperture value for landscape photography and waterfalls specifically. Now, ISO you want to keep as low as possible. I always keep mine on ISO 100 when I'm starting out. So usually my settings workflow goes like 1/3 of a second, f/16, ISO 100, and I'll try the photograph there. If I still need streaking in the water and I still have detail within that water that's streaking and the photograph is a little bit too dark, I will lengthen my exposure time. I'll go up to 2 seconds sometime just to see how good that looks, how much light it brings in with that exposure speed, and also how much detail I can still see in the streaking water. Now, that will depend on how fast the water is moving. Faster water is going to streak a lot more. So if the water is moving really fast, I'll try to keep it around 1/3 of a second to be able to see all that detail that's flowing within the water. If the water is moving a lot more slowly, I can go a longer exposure speed. Something like 2 seconds is usually max of what I'll do with slower moving waterfalls. Now, if I can't lengthen my exposure time with waterfall photography because of the motion of the water and too much streaking in the water, what I will do is increase my ISO. So I'll go anywhere from 100 to 400. I've even gone up to 800 sometimes, depending on that. ISO is usually kind of like the main adjustment that I'll use. So if I like what I have with exposure and aperture, I will use my ISO to balance that exposure out. I will never adjust it from f/16 just because I want everything in focus, and I'll play around with my exposure speed from 1/3 of a second to 2 seconds, but I can always adjust my ISO to balance out that light and get my exposure perfect for waterfall photography. I like my waterfalls to be a little bit darker than usual, still having some detail in the shadows, but having enough detail in the highlights as well to be able to see that motion of the water too. But it's a really good idea to play around with these exposure speeds. Get one that works for you and your photography. Play around with it and discover some of these settings that work best for you and your photographic style and your creativity when you're working with waterfalls, because a lot of times there are multiple different viewpoints of any given waterfall that you can go out and shoot. So play around with these settings, see if you can do something a little more creatively than other people would have done. Alright guys, so in review, first of all, set up your composition first, get out your circular polarizer and spin the polarizer to be able to see through that water, and play around with your camera settings anywhere with an exposure speed of 1/3 of a second to 2 seconds, f/16 and an ISO of 100 to 400, even going up to 800 sometimes is totally acceptable. I hope you get out and take some great photographs of waterfalls in the future, and if you're ever in the Smokies, give me a ring because I'll definitely want to come shoot waterfalls with you. If you liked this video and you found it helpful for your photography, consider subscribing below because we come out with many videos and tutorials about how you can take better landscape photographs, both in the field and tutorials as well.